Good morning and welcome to the webinar hosted by Eagle Hill Consulting, the annual performance review, old school or timeless tool. Our agenda this morning is logistics and introductions, an in-depth review of Eagle Hill's latest white paper, some information on making your decision about performance reviews, information on Eagle Hill's approach to performance reviews, and then we'll take your questions. In terms of logistics for the conference call today, all of our attendees are in listen-only mode, but we do encourage your questions. You'll see a dialog box on your screen. You can type in your questions as the presentation progresses. We will answer all of your questions by reading them aloud following the review of the report. Following this webinar, you'll receive an email with the link to a replay of the session, which we're currently recording. This report and all others from Eagle Hill are available at www.eaglehillconsulting.com. We encourage you to take a look at those at your convenience. We also encourage you to share information about this webinar and any information that's relevant to you on social media. Our handle is @WeAreEagleHill. If you have any audio or technical issues during the webinar, please contact GoToWebinar at 1-800-263-6317. Introductions, we have two speakers today. The first speaker is Melissa Jezior. She's Eagle Hill President and CEO. And the second is Adam Fernandez. He's a director here at Eagle Hill. Melissa founded the company in 2003. She has more than 20 years of experience in management consulting, and she broke away from the big pack of traditional consulting firms to establish a collaborative, unified entrepreneurial firm here at Eagle Hill. Under her leadership, the company has grown rapidly and received multiple top workplace awards. You may have seen that the company was recognized as being a top workplace by both Washingtonian and the Washington Post late last year. Companies that Eagle Hill works with to deliver value and business results are a broad range of organizations, from PBS to the FDA to the Department of Homeland Security, just to name a few. So with that, we'll turn the presentation over to Melissa, where she will do an in-depth review of the white paper. Melissa?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kelly. I've also asked Adam Fernandez, one of our experts in human capital, to join us as well. So why are we talking about this? So if any of you have read or seen any of the headlines lately, you know that so many different companies are scrapping the performance review. So I think lately it's been in the news: Adobe, Microsoft, GE, Deloitte, Gap, just to name a few. In fact, we found research from the Corporate Executive Board saying 6% of all Fortune 500 companies to date have ditched their annual performance review. So this was enough to give us pause here at Eagle Hill to say, well, what's going on here? And we wanted to say, before just eliminating the performance review, what do the employees think about eliminating the performance review? Now, there's definitely a lot of research out there that certainly defends why an organization would want to move away from a performance review. I mean, many of you probably on the call have gone through the process yourself, not only as an employee, but as a manager. And if you have, you know it's extremely time-consuming and time-intensive. Again, CEB says they think about managers spend on average 200 hours a year on performance review activities. And they also have a stat that says for an organization that has 10,000 employees, they estimate that the company spends $35 million a year just to conduct these reviews. So those are pretty compelling numbers that makes you give pause and thinks about whether or not should I follow this trend? Should my organization follow this trend and eliminate the performance review? So as I said, we wanted to say, well, before just jumping on the bandwagon, what do employees think? So we surveyed 1,600 professionals across multiple industries and generations to ask them what they think of the performance review process as it traditionally stands. And interestingly enough, we found that the findings are divided. There's not a consensus as to whether or not people love or hate the performance review. In fact, I think they're pretty evenly divided as to whether or not they think organizations should stay with the traditional process or they should move on to this new age process. So let's review some of the findings. So the first thing we did is we wanted to find out how the survey participants felt about their last review. As you can see here, 54% of people surveyed were pleased. That number actually surprised a bunch of us here at Eagle Hill. We thought that number was going to be much lower. That said, you can see here that the numbers on people that were not as happy, the emotions associated with not being as happy were much lower. So only 10% demotivated, 6% surprised, and 5% angry. So the next slide you'll see is how does your organization use performance reviews? So you can see pretty consistently here, reviews seem to be used to benchmark what was accomplished last year at 78%, and 77% said to make sure both my manager and I are on the same track in terms of goals and priorities. You can see the least reason that reviews are used are forward-looking to talk about how the employee can grow into the next promotion. So the next questions we asked is do you have a culture of feedback? So you can see here 55% agree that my manager provides regular informal feedback on my job performance. And only 49% think it's a good idea to eliminate the performance review altogether and replace it with more of a system of informal feedback. These are other interesting tidbits that we found surprising. So you'll see here that large and very large organizations, they are much more willing to move to a process of more informal, regular feedback. So they, by and large, don't like the performance review process, as opposed to small and mid-sized firms seem to actually more likely are more apt to like the performance review process and are less willing or excited about the idea of going to a more informal process. And then last but not least, we asked people what they thought about linking compensation to performance reviews. So you'll see here 65% believe their last performance review was an accurate reflection of their performance, and only 43% are confident that salaries and or bonuses can be fairly determined. So that number really stood out to us here at Eagle Hill, that only 43% are confident with the salary and bonus decisions. So the next part we'd like to talk to you about is, well, what does all of this data mean, and how can it impact and influence your own decision when thinking about whether or not your organization should follow the trend? And I'm going to turn it over here to Adam to talk a little bit more about some things you should consider.
All right, thank you, Melissa. As Melissa mentioned, there's a lot of research out there that kind of shows why organizations are moving away from formal performance reviews. And our own research found, at least some information that should give employers pause when they're thinking about how to change their system. And so many of you on the call are probably thinking, what does this mean for me? How can I use this information in my own organization? And so what we've done here is we've taken some of that data and some of that research and tried to come up with 5 key areas or 5 key questions to ask yourself about your own organization before you make any big change to a performance review system. So the first one is to define how your organization uses performance reviews today. A couple minutes ago, we talked about several potential functions of a performance review. Some of those were setting goals, helping employees level set their performance against those goals, and talking about performance and promotion readiness. So if you eliminate a formal performance review, you need to make sure that your new system has in place mechanisms for those discussions and that information to still be shared between employees and their supervisors. The next area is to gauge how your employees feel about the existing process. If it's a process that largely works to your employees' satisfaction currently, you should be careful about changing it. There's always room for improvement, but you do want to make sure that whatever you are replacing the system with is an improvement over what you have now. The third area is to assess whether or not your organization has a culture of providing feedback. So some important questions to ask here are, do your supervisors and team leads regularly provide feedback to their teams outside of a formal process? Have employees themselves been trained on how to give and receive feedback in a productive way? Will employees accept real-time or informal feedback well, or will it be seen negatively or threateningly? One example here, a recent client we worked with, we found that in their culture, the performance review was really the only time that supervisors felt comfortable talking about performance with their staff. So in this example, we advised against scrapping their performance review system altogether without some significant culture changes, because you do want to make sure that you're not removing the one mechanism that is working today without replacing it with something that will work equally well. The fourth thing to look at is the size of your organization and how that size impacts performance management. As we mentioned before, employees of larger organizations are more likely to favor or feel comfortable with an informal process over a formal one. Employees in a smaller organization may believe that that more structured process is necessary. And related to this point, you also want to make sure that whether you believe your organization is in growth mode and will get significantly larger, or if you see a contraction coming, you want to make sure that your current process aligns with that where you are today and where you see the organization going. You don't want to build a process that you need to be changing constantly because it works so well with where you are today, but in 12 months you find that either your organization is too big or too small for that process to work effectively. And then finally, you want to evaluate if compensation should or shouldn't be linked to the performance review process. So most employees in our study did believe that a formal review was needed for their organization to fairly adjust their compensation relative to their performance. So employees need to have confidence that their salaries have been set appropriately and that they're adjusted appropriately based on that employee's impact to the organization. So whatever your new system is should be set up in a way that continues to give employees that confidence. One recent client that we worked with, they found that their employees very strongly believed that a formal process was needed to be able to fairly measure their performance and to be able to adjust their compensation appropriately. And they were concerned that getting rid of the performance review process would lead to unfairness in how compensation was set. So the other thing we want to talk about here is, and I think that's important for organizations to think about, is how you are using your performance reviews to communicate compensation. So if the performance review is where that compensation discussion happens, then you need to be sure that whatever that new process is, if you do choose to eliminate or modify your performance review process, that your new process still allows for that conversation to happen, and that employees have a way to communicate with their leadership about their compensation. So all of this is a lot to think about, and what we're going to do next is we're actually going to walk through how we as Eagle Hill use this same framework to evaluate and improve our own performance review process. And I'll turn it back to Melissa for that discussion.
Excellent. Thanks, Adam. So with seeing all of the headlines in the paper, we at Eagle Hill took pause as well to figure out whether or not this is a trend we should follow or whether or not we should stick with our existing process. So a couple of things we did to investigate and come up with our answers is survey our employees to get a sense of how things are currently working. So as part of our larger all-employee survey, we asked a couple of questions directly related to performance. So I'd like to share some of those statistics with you. So a couple of questions we asked is, my immediate supervisor gives me useful feedback. So 80% of our current workforce believes that they get useful feedback. They either agree or agree or strongly agree. 87% also believe they get this feedback in a timely fashion. So by and large, it means people are getting feedback on a regular basis and are getting it pretty frequently. The other question we asked is whether or not employee reviews are fair and appropriate. Only 8% of our workforce disagrees with this. So you can also see that our current process is working pretty well. So using this as kind of our basis, despite the fact we do invest a lot of time and money into our process, and it is cumbersome, as I said earlier, it takes a lot of time and energy, we think it's worth it. So we decided not to scrap our current process, but instead we decided to spend some time tweaking it. So our current process is actually modeled after Laszlo Bock. He's the Chief People Officer, I believe, of Google. He's written a book recently. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's called Work Rules. So our process is really inspired by Google's. A couple of salient points. First is that every employee, we call it 5-point feedback because we look for 5 different perspectives, but it's essentially 360-degree feedback. So each one of our employees gets 360-degree feedback. We do this twice a year for our younger folks and once a year for our more senior folks. So what we do is we submit our recommended 5-point feedback participants. We solicit the feedback, we document it, and then we conduct our review discussions. About our review discussions, we have separated our bonus and salary process from our actual review discussion. We did this because we want to make sure that our employees can be present for those discussions and not just waiting for what's my number. Instead, how do we help our employees grow and develop? And so we wanted to make sure we separated those two so we could have really good, meaningful conversations with our employees. Other thing we do is we don't follow a bell curve. Don't believe that our employees are that's not actually reflective of our workforce. So when we look at overall performance, we don't try to mold it into a bell curve. We just follow what employees are actually doing. So for example, 25% of our current workforce was rated at the highest level in our framework. So that kind of gives you a sense of how things go. Another piece of our performance review process is we also calibrate. So we go through a process where we get everybody in a room together to make sure that how one manager is assessing their direct reports is along the same way that another manager is. So it's basically making sure that, in high school, there was always that one teacher that was the super hard grader and everybody hated to have that teacher. We're basically trying to eliminate that. So we want to eliminate individual biases. And so we get everybody together to talk about things. So we come up with a common understanding of our expectations. And that's how we make sure we basically quote unquote grade everybody. So those are just a couple of key things about our own performance review process. And like I said, for the current time being, we don't have any plans to scrap it. We plan to kind of keep monitoring our own process to see how it's going, hopefully continue to improve it, and then over time, see how it goes. So that's all we have, Kelly.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And now we'll move on to the Q&A portion of the webinar. As a reminder, if you have questions, there is a question box on your computer screen. If you can just type in a question there, and then we will read it aloud, and Melissa or Adam can take a shot at answering it. I'm going to exit out of the presentation here just so I can read the questions that we have in the question box.
Sure, and I'll just add one thing too. I know, Kelly, you skipped over a slide there. That was my bad on the feedback. I just want to make a point that we had also done previous research on feedback on feedback. So we just wanted to put that in there. So if anyone is interested, since these two topics are so closely linked, that is there for you to go check out.
Great. Okay, it looks like we do have a couple questions in the queue. Let me take a second and read those. If our organization decides to scrap its annual compensation review, how do we set up compensation structures? Okay, I think that's a good one for Adam.
No, that's a great question. And it is, as I mentioned before, and as Melissa alluded to, I think that compensation piece is something that is very obviously near and dear to employees' hearts. And so you need to make sure that, that is still getting its due. And so one thing we've seen with other organizations, and we try to recommend to folks who are looking to remove that formal process, is really making sure that there's a way to document the feedback that comes out of some of those more frequent direct conversations with supervisors, so that that information can be used in an aggregate way at the end of the year or whenever the salary adjustments happen to still be able to measure people's performance appropriately. The one thing it doesn't do, or at least makes it much harder to do, is that calibration process that Melissa mentioned. It's much harder to calibrate one supervisor's review of an employee against another supervisor's review of another employee when it's feedback that's being gathered along the way and then is used several months later. But it's a great question, and I think it is one of the most challenging things here is to keep that faith that employees have that they really are being measured fairly and being compensated for it.
Terrific. Our next question, if we decide to keep our annual review process, are there small things that we can do to improve that annual compensation and review process?
I think probably the first thing I would recommend would be probably to start with asking your own employees how they think things are going, and use that as a way to drive what areas might need improvement. I'd also ask your managers what do they see as working and what do they see as not working, and use that to drive your improvement. The other aspect that you might be able to do that we see on a regular basis is sometimes managers in general just have a hard time having the conversations. So making sure that your managers are equipped to be able to have those conversations. So training them is another quick and easy way to make sure people are comfortable.
And I would say, building off that point, one of the other things that we found is really, a quick hit for a lot of places is to make sure that employees themselves have been trained on how to give feedback. Because when you're doing a 360 review, you're often going to go to an employee's peers. So making sure that that those peers know how to have that discussion, what types of feedback to give, what types of feedback might not be appropriate for a formal review. So even if you keep your process, if you can improve the quality of the data that you're getting out of it, it will make the process work even smoother.
Thank you. Our next question, it looked like employees at smaller firms were a little bit different from employees at larger firms in terms of their preferences for the annual review process. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So this was actually, this was one of those data points. There's always that one thing in a survey that surprises you a little bit when you get the data back. And for me personally, at least, this was one that surprised me. And so we started thinking about it a little bit more and started to reflect on our own experiences and what we've seen from client organizations. And to me, I think what this boils down to is that, when you're in a smaller organization, oftentimes having something that's more formal and more structured may give you that additional comfort of knowing that even though I am in a small organization, this is a healthy organization. This is an organization that takes performance very seriously because despite their small size, they do have a very rigorous system in place. And so to me, that's probably where that data point comes from, is that it's a reassurance to employees that, that their small organization is taking it seriously.
Thank you. And it looks like we have one more question in the queue, or maybe two it might be. This one's from Melissa. You mentioned that you are on a different time cycle for your junior employees and your senior employees for the annual review process. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think we as a leadership team agreed that we felt comfortable moving to a once a year process. I think because we do have we have a culture of feedback. We are regularly giving each other feedback that we felt a better investment of our time was spent on our more junior employees. So that's why we have a biannual for our junior employees and a once a year for our more senior employees.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting. And it looks like we have one more question in the queue. Let me read that one aloud. Thank you for all the insight, knowledge, and sharing. If possible, I'd like to hear if you have comments on the best practices for distinguishing between project-level reviews and annual performance reviews, particularly in the consulting world where projects end during the year, but performance is assessed at the end of the year. That's a good question.
Mm-hmm. I think they're almost one and the same. I view the annual review as a roll-up of all the project reviews. So I simply look at it as a roll-up fashion. What about you, Adam?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think one thing that we try to do here is we try to make sure, obviously, since the question asked about consulting specifically, that we are in a client service business, so we want to make sure that the majority of the feedback that people get comes from how well they are doing that client service, and so we do try to make sure that we are measuring people primarily on the impact they've had on their clients' organizations. That being said, we are also growing very fast. And so people get a lot of opportunities here to, help on the internal side of that growth too, whether it's, with marketing, with business development, with thought leadership, and we want to make sure that that's being accounted for. So we do try to build a system where people's client performance is augmented or is enhanced by what they're able to do inside the firm, and that we are, taking both of those things very seriously.
Terrific. So we have a couple more questions that have come in. Generally, are you both fans of a large 10-plus set of competencies or a smaller 4 to 6 set of performance reviews? I guess review measures, maybe?
Competencies that we have in our model.
Right. Versus a performance review? Not sure I understand.
Well, maybe we can take that one offline.
Yeah. Or could someone could someone clarify?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I understand the difference between, I think they're two different things.
Okay.
That's why I'm struggling. It's probably just definitions, but in my mind, I'm not sure I understand.
So if the attendee who had the question, if you could just clarify a little bit about the competencies.
Oh wait, I misread the question. I understand it now. Sorry, got it.
Okay.
Okay, sorry. Yes. So is a large set or small set of competencies is the question.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I misunderstood. Got it. My bad. Okay, so I think I don't know if I'm a fan either way. I think either works. I think so long as if you have a smaller number of competencies, I think you still need to evaluate. You always run into the thing of having to evaluate somebody on something and finding out the best place to put it when you only have a certain number of small competencies. But I think the important thing is still being able to review on those things, just finding the best place for those when you have a small number of competencies. So I think so long as you're comfortable having more of a flexible definition when you have smaller number of competencies, it's fine. So long as you're always evaluating for the full breadth of professional distinction, importance, competencies. Adam, do you have any comments?
No, I agree with that. I think the only thing I'd add to that is, being flexible with those competencies. That's one thing we've found over time, at least, is how we define the competencies, how people can demonstrate proficiency in them may change as the organization changes. So even if the number stays the same, making sure that, you're communicating with people about what those expectations are. But I do agree. I think it kind of depends on every organization, on what the folks are doing, the complexity of the work, the type of work they're doing. All those types of things will drive whether 4 or 6 is the right answer, or 10 or 12, or even more than that is the right answer. But I think having enough that people feel that coming out of it, that they got a fair shake is what's really important.
Terrific. Well, thanks everyone for all those terrific questions. And this concludes our webinar. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to give us a call. Melissa's contact information is here, and Eagle Hill can be reached at 703-229-8600. We thank you for your participation, and we will send you a follow-up email with where you can watch a replay of this webinar. Thank you and have a great day.